might make a start, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies. Welcome to the ACT branch of the AIIA. My name is Heath McMichael and I'm branch president. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge also the ambassadors of Peru and the Netherlands here tonight. Hopefully everyone's had the chance to have some delicious Christmas canapes and some liquid cheer. There might be one or two things left for after the event if you're quick. So we normally like to end our year with a light-hearted function, but the opportunity to discuss the ramifications of major war between Australia's chief international partners, China and the United States, was something we felt shouldn't be put off. And the strong turnouts tonight suggests there is solid interest in the topic, and indeed in our expert speaker. We're very fortunate to have with us, once again, one of Australia's foremost strategic thinkers, Dr. Ross Babbage, the CEO of Strategic Forum Limited. Ross is well known to many of us here, as his expertise in strategic analysis stretches back decades. In the 1980s, he was Senior Strategic Analyst in the Office of National Assessments, led the branch in the Department of Defence responsible for ANZUS policy. In the 1990s, he worked in the corporate sector, shaping or reshaping the loss-making government-owned Office of Defence Production. This century, he founded and chaired the Kokoda Foundation to research the really tough security challenges. They're Ross's words, by the way, when he last addressed the branch in March 2008. And also to foster the next generation of young strategic thinkers. More recently, apart from maintaining a prodigious output of publications, Ross has been consulting through his for-profit vehicle, Strategic International, ACT, and fostering high-level dialogue on strategic issues via the not-for-profit Strategic Forum Limited. And in January 2011, to mark all this work, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia. Now, Ross has been busy this year with the launch of his latest book on the topic we're addressing tonight, The Next Major War, Can America and Its Allies Win Against China? Published by Canberra Books in New York. The book has been described as a timely, sobering and essential read, and an absolute wake-up call for the foreign policy ruling classes. Oh, yes. So now that everyone's awake, I'll conclude with the housekeeping. As per our normal format, Ross will speak for 30 minutes or so before we go to questions from participants in-house and from those online using the Q&A function on Zoom. We aim to finish at 7 p.m. So please, Ross, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Heath. Let me say it is a true delight to be here. And as I look around the room, I can see quite a few people who are former colleagues and certainly current and continuing friends. And it's great to see you tonight. But also great to see a number of people who I should have met before but haven't. And I hope we have a chance before everyone disperses later on to talk more if we haven't had a chance to speak already. Heath, thank you for your kind introduction and in words. Actually, with that sort of introduction, even I'm quite looking forward to what I might say. I'll do my best. Now, Heath did ask me to not only speak to this topic directly, which I'm going to do, pretty rapidly, and I'm going to work on the principle that the eye is faster than the mouth, and I'm not going to address every point that comes up on the screen, but I think you'll get the gist of it, and we can come back to individual points if you want elaboration as we go. But he also asked me to bookend that presentation with a few comments and reflections on the year that's coming to an end now, and at the end, a few points about what we might keep our eyes out for next year. And I'm going to try and do that too. So let's flick on if we can, Emily. So here are some of my thoughts about this year. You might have different thoughts, but these are some of the things that are sort of fairly prominent in my mind. The fact that Ukraine is going long, and frankly, that's not a surprise really, but a lot of people weren't expecting that, perhaps in quite the way it has been. I think the US has had some successes in terms of expansion of NATO, but also in terms of building the network of like-minded states in the Indo-Pacific. I think the US has been more successful than many would have assumed it would be. I think that I've been working very intensely, which for those who don't know, we'll soon find out, on China for the last several years. And so what I've been looking at what's really going on in China. Of course, the economy is in some trouble, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's fairly new. A lot of Australians don't realise what's really going on domestically. But Xi Jinping, despite all that, is continuing to drive very hard and press his system for his broad international expansion, if you like, agenda, and certainly continue to fund very generously the military build-up. Of course, recent weeks have underlined the fact that terrorism hasn't gone away is a serious problem. But I think the main theme that I've noticed, and others may have other perceptions, is that really the world, whether we like it or not, is moving, graduating in multiple dimensions into three main camps. There is the United States, allies and partners, and that's a pretty big camp. There is also, though, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and a few others, not very major states mostly. But then there's a very large group of neutral states, you might call, but of different shades of neutrality. So which, sort of leaning towards the West, some of which don't. I think this is really interesting. Perhaps not surprising given where we're at. We might come back to a bit of that later on. Let's go to the next slide. So the main 4 points I want to touch on and emphasize very, very briefly. Why is it a serious risk? Why should we be concerned about what we're seeing, that it might really become a very serious problem for us? What is Xi Jinping's approach to this? How do they plan to fight a war? Because they are planning and preparing, believe it or not, and I'll show you some of that tonight. America's approach, how's the United States approaching this? And finally, a bit about, very brief, only 1 or 2 slides, about what does it mean for us in terms of practicalities? What should we be thinking about doing or doing now? Let's go to the first point. So why is war a serious threat? Let's flick on 2, please. So you can see China and the United States most prominently are at loggerheads about a number of issues, but particularly about the future of Taiwan. And you can see the quotations there. They're pretty strong. Xi Jinping has promised his people on numerous occasions that Taiwan will be incorporated into China. No ifs, no buts. And he's promised that almost every opportunity he gets. So whether we like it or not, in his own terms, complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and definitely will be fulfilled. And I'm sure those who've been following what actually happened on the 15th of November in the US and California, that Xi actually was reported as saying these things to President Biden. Taiwan is the biggest and most dangerous issue in US-China relations. He prefers, as he always has said he does, a peaceful reunification. In other words, he wants the Taiwanese to basically give in. But he cannot rule out, in some situations, force may be needed. Now, it's really interesting. He also pressed President Biden to stop arming Taiwan. Next slide. But we're seeing lots of things about what they're doing here that fall behind all this. Very rapid Chinese military buildup. Annual defence spending is growing this year, 7.2% increase, despite the problems in the economy. Of course, China now has by far the largest army, navy, and air force in the Indo-Pacific, and also missile forces, especially theatre, ballistic, and cruise missiles. What is interesting, a lot of people have missed, is that early this year and the previous year a bit, the Chinese updated their mobilisation laws, and they stood up their mobilisation organisations in every province. And now they have routine practicing in terms of mobilising to actually for a major conflict. And in fact, we've seen reports of some companies being asked to prepare and plan to manufacture defence-related equipment, even though they're not normally in that sector. So they're actually doing trial demonstrations of what they could do in a crisis and how quickly they can actually produce some of that stuff. What we've also seen, of course, we saw a PLA general who was doing most of the analysis on Taiwan contingencies for Beijing, a relatively junior general, was suddenly elevated to be the second most powerful guy. He's actually one of the two deputies in the Central Military Commission. So he's really one of the two most senior military advisors for Xi Jinping. This is, I hesitate to say it, but I think it's almost unprecedented for someone relatively junior to be elevated in that way. China's economic development programs, I'm sure most of you will be aware, there's been a big compromise in the last 4 years. Economic development and infrastructure development and all the rest of it are important, but they're not the most important. And Xi Jinping has been saying security and defense preparations are of equal importance. Can we go to the next? And of course, we're also seeing this. Taiwanese operations, PLA operations routinely into Taiwanese air and sea space. And we're seeing that almost every week, sometimes more frequently than one. So, yeah, forward, please. Okay, there's a lot of other things going on. One of the things the Chinese have done is build full-scale replicas of the major centres of office buildings and so on in Babbage. They built them in Inner Mongolia. This is their replica of the presidential offices, the main president in Taipei. They also have full-scale replica of the foreign ministry and some other ministries. And they've been running cycling regiments, PLA regiments, through practicing attacks on their buildings. Some of them are very elaborate ones in terms of people coming in by helicopter and all sorts of things. Next slide, please. The other thing that they've been doing is they've been on their missiles. This is actually out in the Gobi Desert. These are the impact zones. And you can see this is particularly interesting to me. This, in talking to the Americans about it, obviously these are ships, and the outlines are ships, replica ships in the desert. But what is really interesting is that this shape of the wharfing is very unusual. And the only place in the Western, in the Pacific really generally that they can find is actually the Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan. And what they're doing is throwing missiles at this. Why they're doing this? It's not just because they want to hit those GPS and so on, but I think it's because some of the missiles, of course, have very sophisticated homing sensors and to optically pick up the shape and home in. And so there you can actually see impacts on those. Can we go to the next one, please? And of course, they also have an aircraft carrier outline that's in part of the complex. The next one, please. So on top of all that, let's look at more broadly what they're doing. And we're seeing ongoing intense cyber information warfare and so on, what they could call, of course, political warfare operations against the United States, against Japan, ourselves, and of course, against most other allies. And of course, early this year in May, we saw Xi telling his National Security Commission to be ready for, quote, dangerous storms and the most extreme scenarios. 2 months ago, he ordered the Central Military Commission on Reform to adhere to bottom line thinking and extreme scenarios thinking. We know what he's thinking about because we do have some access to internal debates. The director of the CIA, of course, has said that in a congressional testimony that Xi has ordered the PLA to be ready for a major operation against Taiwan by 2027. And in the face of these very active Chinese preparations, President Biden has, of course, been asked 4 times publicly what the United States will do if China attacks Taiwan. And 4 times, without hesitation, he has said that US forces will fight to defend Taiwan. So what's the strategic conclusion that I've drawn, or others have too? Perhaps is war is not inevitable. I don't want you to go away thinking that it could happen. Well, it could happen soon, but it's certainly not inevitable. But it's a very serious risk, and frankly, we have to take it very seriously in how we think about operating. Very big slide, please. So let me just look at a bit more detail about how the Chinese are planning to and preparing for such a conflict if it happens. Next slide, please. Of course, they tend to think about the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific and the first and second island chains, which if you've been following the literature, you know quite a bit about. But they tend to have a slightly different perspective. Let's go to the next slide. Because they're looking at it more like this. So you've got Japan in the first island chain. Taiwan actually often is shown to be on the island chain. And then you enter into the Philippines and then looping around into part of Indonesia. The second island chain, as you can see, is further out and includes, importantly, Guam and a number of other places. This is where they think, and they're bright, actually, that a future conflict would be very heavily focused, especially in the early phases. Next slide, please. What are then Xi's primarily goals? And I'd suggest that they're these. I don't think this is very controversial. Maintain uncontested Communist Party rule, achieve the China dream, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, reinforce domestic support for the regime and undermine, weaken, and corrupt and divide the West. Very active, particularly through their political warfare operations. Strengthen China's self-reliance and build resilience to be able to fight and sustain an extended war. They plan to fight long. If it comes to a major war, they do not plan. They'd like to have a quick victory, of course, but they know that that's pretty unlikely because there's so much strategic depth on both sides. So they are explicitly planning in lots of different ways, including things they're doing within their broader economy, to fight long and sustain long. And complete national rejuvenation by seizing Taiwan, of course, and also export the model, the Chinese model, elsewhere when they can. Let's go to the next slide. So his primary goals, the so-called new development phase, really, I've mentioned before the compromising of economic growth for national and regime security. And so we're seeing that, of course, is much more than defence. It's control of data, self-reliance in technology and industrial development and so on, and tighter party control of corporations and a whole raft of other things. Common prosperity, attempting to address inequalities, national stability, tamping down discontent and so on, and economic growth. Emphasis is really needed, but only in his mind, pretty clearly, in order to maintain political stability. And fast economic growth is no longer a driving priority. And you can see the results of that. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to just quickly touch on, what keeps him awake at night. It's an interesting question. And I think it's his own security and his regime's security. He does talk about black swans, which is interesting. He uses that term, which is, of course, largely an American term. I like to, with our American friends and sometimes with some in Asia who refer to this, I say, well, come to Australia. We've got black swans everywhere. We even put them on our flags. But he also talks about these things, which some of you might not have heard about, grey rhinos. Grey rhinos are those really big things, serious things, they're big, heavy animals, which they know about. But if they don't actually do something substantial to turn them around, they can come and kill you. And they probably will. And I want to touch on 2 or 3 of those just very quickly. Let's go to the next slide. The first of these is demography. Largely as a result of the one-child policy, which of course was pretty long running. This is still reverberating very strongly through their society. So 45 million workers are going to be lost to the Chinese economy by 2030. And by 2050, 200 million workers will be gone. Population, of course, has now peaked and is now going down. The fertility rate is exceptionally low, lower than Japan's. And a lot of young women do not want children and they can't afford it anyway. And that's their view. There's all sorts of things. There's also very seriously distorted gender balance, for a range of reasons I'm making to elaborate on. In some of the provinces, in some areas, there's more than 20% more males than females. There's a very rapid aging of the population. So by 2040, 250 million people are going to be aged over 50. Think about that. What this means, and this is a good way I like to summarize it, in 2016, there were 7 workers to support each person who was essentially retired, 7 to 1. In 2030, it's only going to be 4 people working for 1 retired. By 2050, it'll be 2 to 1. Now think about that. What does that mean in terms of budgetary allocations and what it means for the nature of the society? Now, former Premier Li said and reminded his colleagues that 600 million Chinese still live in less than 160 US dollars a month. Now, you can't, and he said, No one can actually live in even a single room apartment in a Chinese city for that amount of money. And he was underlining it that not all Chinese are doing that well, and they're not working or wealthy. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing is you can see the bulk of the population by 2050 is here. We're in a process of transition, if you like, here, but you can see the change and how thin it is behind. Let's go to the next one, please. Another great one, grey rhino, is the problems of the economy. And I'm going to be very brief here. China's economy represents about 19% of the global economy. It's really interesting. We talk with Western Creek, the military officers, and most of them have the impression that the Chinese economy is actually more like 40 or even 50% of the global economy. It's nothing like that. Frankly, a lot of Australians, I think that it's different. China's economic growth rate has slowed markedly. There's now only about a quarter of that of 2007. A quarter. Okay, it's actually probably below that. The steady official growth rate right now, they say, is about 4.5. It's actually not. It's more like, it certainly has a 3, maybe even a 2 in front of it. The real rate is lower. And of course, they fudge figures routinely, so you've got to be careful with what we take for granted. And of course, a lot of their subsidies and so on support it. Remember that aggregate debt in China is very high. At the moment, it's running about 335% of GDP. Think about that. So the interest only, if you were paying interest on this, each year is now more than double the GDP growth rate. So productivity growth has also fallen. It's now 1% or lower. And so they're losing their competitiveness in a lot of markets, including a lot of manufacturing markets. China's economy remains heavily dependent on, of course, on imported energy, key resources, and a range of technologies. And importantly, the regime has been reducing the international economic exposure of the country by pushing self-reliance. It's pulling a lot of things back into the country, wanting to do them themselves, really. And a large part of the drive for that is for security. And Xi is investing heavily to dominate some key high-tech sectors, but that's running into problems that are making modest progress. Importantly, trade as a percentage of GDP has more than halved since 2006. That's partly because they're pulling so much back home. Homeshoring, so much for it. And investments overseas have also been cut heavily since 2016. So while they talk about Belt and Road and all that sort of stuff, and people think they're taking over the world, in fact, since 2016, the amount of money they're actually putting up has been cut by 40%. And incidentally, the locations where it's going, there's also changed. Let's go to the next slide. So the regime's ambitions are undiminished, but its sense of insecurity is high, and including domestic insecurity. This is the most, they've got more CCTV cameras, I think, than any other society in the world. The latest figure I've seen is about 400 million, but I've heard some people say that they think it's well over 500 million. And of course, that's linked to the social credit system. So that if you're a Chinese citizen, you arrive at an airport or anywhere else, facial recognition, they'll know exactly who you are. They can actually print out if they want to, within a few seconds, actually, certainly within 60 seconds, a pretty detailed review of who you are, your financial status, who your friends are, even what you believe, where you're employed, all the rest of it. And of course, there's the Great Firewall. And of course, they don't have, most Chinese citizens cannot access international web in the way that we can. I won't talk too much about the tenure in the party. I'm sure you know about that. Now, what we're seeing, though, is a further tightening of party control, stricter business regulations, and the regime's aggressive international behaviour. What we've seen is a degree of unease behind the scenes. We're aware of it, particularly in some sectors of the economy, and there are, to some extent, some new instabilities. Nevertheless, if you're in Xi's position, there's a debate running about whether that makes him more secure or less, and whether he feels an increased incentive to actually conduct some sort of international adventure, because he knows if he does, because it's very popular at home, that will tie the country more tightly to him. Let's go to the next one, please. So, of course, their whole approach to war is different. Their definition of war is different to we in the West. It goes back to Lenin and their study of that and Stalin. Actually, Xi Jinping's arguably bedside reading. One of his favourites is Stalin's works, would you believe? We would believe it from Stalin. But what it really boils down to, if war is politics by other means, then politics can be war by other means. So political action and the boundary separating war and politics is permeable. You can go across. War can embrace continuous information influence campaigns and other non-kinetic, in other words, things that don't go bang, operations right through to major kinetic war. And this continuum requires the employment of a very wide range of instruments, not just the military. So they're not just seeing, when they see war, they're not just thinking about the military in the way that most Westerners do. And of course, Mao Zedong elaborated on this in his own circumstances. And Mao's series of lectures, if you like, presentations, which was published shortly thereafter his time by called Unprotected War, has suddenly come back in the last 5 years, and it's been republished big time. And it's actually a lot of references to that in the way that they're doing their planning and the way they think about conflict today. We need to go back to it and look at it, which is something we've done. Let's go to the next one, please. So I just very quickly to summarize, well, what are their main instruments? Well, you've got the information influence. This is all the political warfare stuff, but of course it goes into subversion, political disintegration operations. They use that term a lot, disintegration, encouraging foreign enemy states to disintegrate. That's what they're out to do. And if they can get a lot of that done now, great, in their point of view. Geostrategic instruments, all this stuff. Economic instruments, of course, to win advantages, but also build dependencies. And of course, as we ourselves have seen, to attempt to coerce. But flows of money have, of course, declined significantly, especially into Western and related states since 2016. But also, of course, there's military and paramilitary forces. And let's not forget the legal and paralegal instruments. This is the arguing, you see it most obviously in places like the South China Sea, where they're arguing things which make no sense under international law at all. But nevertheless, they're arguing. And look what they're doing right now in the Philippines EEZ. It's unquestionably serious breaches of international law. But they're, enough of that. Next one. Okay, so when they think about war, they don't just think about peace and war. Clearly, they think about grey zone, grey activities, and then you get, firstly, non-kinetic, perhaps, this sort of stuff. We're seeing a lot of this now in various phases. But also then, if it becomes a shooting war in a serious way, they plan to be early and very heavy, and they're structured. Look at how their missile systems are actually deployed today and how big they are and what they're targeting. We've got a lot of information on that, and it's pretty obvious that a lot of stuff would be fired in the first 48 hours if it comes to that. Extended medium intensity kinetic and attrition warfare. They do use this word attrition periodically, and long-term attrition and asymmetric hostility. So they see their primary advantage is in staying power. And they look around and they see the United States, or even now, after how many months is it, getting hesitant in Congress about Ukraine. And their attitude is, they remember Vietnam. Eventually, they just outlasted. And they also often talk about what did it take for the United States to get out of Afghanistan? Well, I'm sure many of you in this room would know that the Americans took no casualties at all in the last 12 months, but nevertheless, they came out. May think that the Americans will get weak-kneed and give up if they can sustain. Next slide, please. So these are some 9 features. I'm not going to go through them all, except this is really what we see in a sort of summary form about the way they are approaching this. DIME, for those who don't have a military background, maybe you wonder what on earth I'm talking about here. This is the main centers of power. In the West, it's often, this is an acronym. It's a diplomacy, information, military, and economic. They're the main elements of power in a Western mind. And some people add science and technology. They don't see it like that at all. And when they look at this, they're often looking at between 20 and 30, often more like 30 elements, and a lot of detailed stuff on ideology, strength of will, etc., and assessments of that sort of nature, soft assessments as being critical to judging how successful they can be. And they're working those spaces now in a range of ways, a lot of those spaces. So in military terms, surprise, short duration offensives, really for political purposes. A bit like for those who remember the Tet Offensive, which really made Washington rethink and say, we can't do this. That's what they want to do. They want to do a succession of Tet Offensives, which might not make full sense militarily, but would undermine willpower to persist in Washington and the other allied capitals. And then, of course, they want to do this. Remember, the primary currency of victory for them is political. It's not military. So only you got to think about it, try and get in their mindset. I think about it rather differently to the way we tend to think about things. Next one, please. So very quickly, American approach to war. I'm not going to go through all these things. There are many strengths the Americans do have, and the Allies too. And there's some of them listed there. Next slide, please. But there are some weaknesses, including misperceptions, including there's a failure. In fact, this was a subject of discussion with a senior American earlier today. The failure of leadership in the United States and here to be honest with our public and explain what a crisis might look like. And so people that have the opportunity to take account of that, what it means for their households and what it means for how they can compare maybe their businesses or whatever it might be. There's no clear agreed strategy. The forces are primarily structured for military operations and conventional war, not a lot else. And a pattern of constrained expenditure and so on. I'm going to touch on these other things in a minute. We'll just be very quick. I want to show you a couple of slides. This is their pattern of US defense expenditure to 2020. And you can see, it's given the challenges we now face, it's really a surprise to me that as a percentage of GDP, it's so low for the US. Next slide, please. The other thing which the Chinese talk a lot about in-house is the polarization within US society and the difficulties of getting coherence in a crisis. And they know damn well what's going on. They follow the polling very closely. But one of the things that they look at is this sort of thing, like, how have trends in terms of percentage of public trust in Washington gone? And look what's happened. Look what happened under G.W. Bush, under Obama, and Trump. I don't think it's improved much since. Let's see the next one. There's actually a whole lot of stuff I could show you, and normally would if we had time, about other polling and how it shows the divisions within US society. I mean, it's a different ballgame to keep. I'm not saying that we're united fully in this country, but let me tell you, in the US, it's something else again. And the Chinese know it, and they're actively trying to exacerbate those divisions in their political warfare, information campaigns, and so on. And in some areas, they're being pretty successful. So this is just a sort of symptom, if you like, anti-government demonstrations, and this is riots in the US and how that's changed. Let's go to the next slide. This is perhaps a more important thing. Many of us have grown up thinking about, well, don't worry, because the US has got the so-called arsenal democracy in both world wars, particularly the Second World War. It really saved a lot of our skin, didn't it? Because we had this huge industrial base on which to draw and to bail us out. Well, let me show you what's actually happening since 2004, the last 20 years. This is China's industrial output, and this is the United States industrial output. So you can see the United States had more than double Chinese industrial output, more than double China's industrial output in 2004. But by 2020, you can see China's industrial output is almost double that of the United States. Now think about that. If you're looking to mobilize your economy and have an industrial base that can actually produce the wherewithal quickly that you're going to need in a crisis, then that's a serious problem.
Sorry, just handle this first. Why don't you come out?
What could be said about what we should be doing? I'm just going to give you a summary, one page. Let's go to the next page. And here's some other things. In military terms, all of these things are subject to debate, of course. But really what we need is what I call high leverage capabilities. These are things that can make a real difference on the battlefield. We could have all sorts of, it might be nice to have, double or triple the number of infantry battalions, but bottom line is that's not going to change the game. But there are other things we do have the option of doing, which have the potential to change the game. That's what I'm talking about with high leverage, both in deterrence terms and in strike power. Strengthen, disperse, and protect bases and infrastructures. We are very vulnerable. We're highly concentrated, and most of our systems are not protected. We need to also do serious things about mobilisation, so that we can actually activate the civilian economy if we need it and how we need it. Information and political warfare. This is we're doing quite a bit in this space in terms of protective measures now, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. Supply chain, industrial support, and supply chain security is really, really important. And we need to look at where our own businesses and our own economy, where we're pulling material, and if it's coming from secure and trusted sources, is one thing. But if it's not, we ought to think very carefully about whether we need to reconfigure. Depends a lot on what you're doing, yes. But also there's a big piece of work in terms of networking the allies and partners to actually share industrial capability and do things in, if you like, in a networked way. Because we can't do everything here. The Americans, they can't do everything either. We need to be acting as a team. We need to be a team sport, if you like. And lastly, restore manufacturing dominance. There is more that we can do in this space too, but we've got a long way to go in this space. And but there are things that can be done in terms of onshoring, allied shoring, partner shoring, and so on. And there are things that we can do here if we actually get our act together. And importantly, we've got to make ourselves the productivity level in Australia. Instead of doing ourselves harm, we've got to improve our productivity and international competitiveness. And we've got to take that really seriously, beyond bumper stickers. And we're not. I'll be very blunt with you right now. Okay, last slide, I think. Oh, very quickly. For those who want to, this is not meant to be an ad, except in a direct sense, but if you really want to research this stuff, there is this book. If you want to consider doing that, I do encourage you. I've got some flyers. Take the flyer. The reason for it is that there's a code on it, and you decide to buy the book, you can get it for 20% off. Okay, so there's a benefit. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ross. That sets up for a great discussion, I think. Who would like to begin the questions? We could.
Just very quickly, issues to watch. These are mine. You might have other ones. I won't go through. I mean, the Chinese themselves, some of the Chinese, in some of the sectors, they do use this term economic malaise. High unemployment of young people, etc. How's that all going to go? What about cross-strait relations, especially after January's elections in Taipei? Very important, etc. And I'm just going to let you look through all this rather than try and obviously what happens in the US with candidates and the elections. Is Ukraine going to get a second wind in the spring? Interesting question. In trying to get the Russians out. What about the Western European allies? They've actually moved a lot of ground in the last 18 months, much more than we tend to acknowledge. Where are they going to go from here in terms of especially our part of the world? And what about the Middle East and Gaza and so on? And then lastly, how are we going to go? Are we actually going to lift our game and actually do something more serious to get our act together?
Oh, thank you. Well, you bookended it well there, so we'll have a range. People could be brief with their questions because we've only got 20 minutes or so, and just run through who you are and perhaps even Stan. Start over here first. Thanks.
How much is the PRC planning on nuclear deterrence to achieve fait accompli? My view is that they've won a lot from the deterrence experts, the US and the US are in Cold War.
Well, the Chinese, one thing I haven't addressed properly here, just in the interest of time, they are, of course, greatly expanding their nuclear force, and also the command and control and other related elements to the total system. And clearly to enhance deterrence in a range of contexts. Our judgment, and this has been debated, including with my, think tank had it in Washington, with senior Americans as well. This has been discussed. I think the general consensus is we can't be sure. We do expect that they will threaten in a crisis. They will threaten nuclear use, especially if they look as though they're taking the hiding over Taiwan, which they might. But they're most unlikely to use nuclear weapons. If they do, they realise the consequences. And the Americans are not mucking around when it comes to that. So I think they fully understand that, but they do feel as though their nuclear force up until now has been, in their view, too limited. The biggest problem is that the Chinese don't really want to get to the arms control table at all, although they recently did engage in a modest discussion on preliminary discussion. But that was not very much. And the other problem for Washington and for the Allies is that you've got the US on the one side with perhaps very small British and French forces. On the other side, you've got two quite big nuclear powers. Russia in its nuclear forces are still pretty strong, and China growing. So how do you do negotiations? Essentially three-way negotiations, and it's possible, but I don't think we're going to see a lot of progress in that space anytime soon.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the lecture. So my first question is, you mentioned we will possibly going to see three camps if there's going to be warfare. For the second camp, it's going to be China and its potential allies. Just a few months ago, China organized the new extensive version of BRICS. They have a new 6 different countries on it. Do you believe that the second camp includes these BRICS? And my second question is, we mentioned economic alliance or economic downturn, and most likely we will see the economic downturn in China because the recent data, very recent, just a few days ago, China is officially in deflation right now. It's minus 0.5 CPI. So some people they argue that China would, like Xi Jinping, would be too busy with saving its economy to invade Taiwan or do anything. But some other people would argue no, he would want to use the rally of the flag kind of effect. Let's just invade Taiwan right now. So I'm wondering what's your take on that? Yeah, thank you.
Great questions. On the BRICS, I think it depends on which BRIC you're looking at. There are differences between them, and they don't really operate very much, frankly, on this sort of issue, on security issues. But look, this is a very live set of issues. The Chinese are putting a lot of emphasis on the BRICS and other developing countries, particularly in Africa and in parts of South America and so on. No question. But a lot of these countries also have ongoing good relations and close relations and trusted relations with the United States and other Western powers, including in Europe, of course, and close ties. So I don't think it's but they're certainly trying to get a lot of these countries into their camp in one way or another. Whether that's ever going to be really effective, I remember a senior Chinese diplomat in a sort of scripted moment, I think it was a year or two back, said something like, "You guys have already got all the good countries in your camp," and there's some truth in that. On deflation, you're absolutely right. There's actually been signs of deflation now for about 9 months in China. This is something which is very sensitive politically. What we're talking about here is prices going backwards, the economy being flat, but it's not uniform. That is, it's in certain sectors. And so, I've also seen just in the last week data coming out on, for instance, steel and heavy industrial production, which is actually going up. And prices are not only holding, but actually going up. Exactly why they want so much steel, because they haven't gone into really a new phase of major infrastructure development and requiring it. And of course, the housing sector, which is about a third of their total economy, is at a shambles. So it's very interesting and very mixed. And I think they pay a huge price for still having a lot of direction in their economy rather than letting free play. But you're right about deflation. I think the other problem, which just to ram home, it's really important you understand the figures that sometimes, without thinking, you find replayed as being, gospel in the Australian media when the regime says
we've got 5% growth this year. Well, actually, the reality is often not. And we know that because we're tracking data from other sources, like everything from electricity production and sales and all sorts of things. You put it all together and there's no way that it gets to 5%. But nevertheless, Xi said that's what it was going to be. And so guess what? They're going to announce that they've achieved it. I bet you. And you'll probably see in January, February, they'll start making, a big, but in reality is something else. How far behind? There's a lot of debate about that. And I won't go further, but except to say that I've got a very strong economic assessment team that works on this stuff, and we follow it very closely.
Yes. Yep.
How serious is Australia as a military objective given our resource base and China's hunger for resources?
Another good question. I don't think in terms of a military offensive to seize, I think they'd like to coerce us into be a sort of tributary state of sort. That's their real wish, ultimate wish for Australia. Although you would have noticed if you've read the last 3 or 4 years, the statements out of Russell Hill, that the judgments they're making about whether someone can actually conduct a military assault against Australia physically, which used to be pretty dismissive, are much less dismissive now. And the reason for that is that they do have, and I'll be very honest with you, my personal view is that if we faced a major conflict where the United States was involved, and inevitably we would, for a range of reasons, then we would be struck by missile strikes, maybe some long-range air attacks, although that might be a bit iffy for them. They'll probably take big losses trying that. We would probably also have some sabotage in Australia. And we also would expect to see submarine operations off our coasts, and probably mining. So a lot of things that we've tended to forget about. But we remember in both world wars, we lost shipping off our coast. We had attacks on some of our ports, and there are some things underway, some of which are public, some of which are not, and to make it harder for them if they to think about this. But we should not, we haven't taken this stuff seriously enough, to be frank. And the other thing, which is a much bigger issue, which is really important, again, for people to understand, we've got into this habit in this country, and the Americans have as well, since the Second World War, of seeing when there's a war, they sort of contract out to the Defence Force. Okay, you guys, go and fight the war, do a good job, we'll help fund it, and then come back when you've got the job done. End of story. And the society just rolls on as though nothing much is happening except paying maybe marginally high taxes. This would not be anything like that. And this is where I'm particularly critical, and some of my colleagues in particularly the US are, not just about our country. We are not being honest with our people. Now, it's really interesting. Who does this well? It's actually the best people, in my view, who do this well are actually the Scandinavians. And you ought to see what they actually say to help people understand that they may be facing a security crisis downstream, and what they should do in their households and how they should operate in their businesses and all the rest of it. They're very clever and they're very moderate in their language and very appropriate. They're not trying to scare people. They're just simply saying, get real. This is something we have to, as a society, work on. They also, for executives of business and for the public sector as well, they run short courses, about a week long, to brief them in detail about what the challenges will likely be and who's doing what in terms of not only government, but what they're looking for in individual sectors of the economy to help out on in a range of, frankly, just my understanding, because I've spoken to some pretty key people on this, they're very honest in giving straight answers. And so they should be. So it's very successful in terms of getting a society, not scaring them, but actually so that psychologically they're getting prepared. I'm sure the Chinese are doing this. They're talking about a lot to their public, although we're not seeing it, about, they talk about get prepared. Xi himself has given several speeches, get prepared for the new long march. Now, what does that mean to you? All high school kids in China know what the new long march was like. That is, the Chinese Communist Party, the core of the defense of mountain was down in the south, and they had to trek right across the country. How many people made it to the end? You know how many? Just under 10%. And all Chinese students are taught this, that it's going to be catastrophic. It's going to be unbelievably difficult. Get ready. And that's what he's saying to them. We tend to just goes over our head. Most people wouldn't. So the point I'm really making is they're not mucking around here in terms of getting their society. Look at the economic cost they're spending, what they're spending to actually allow actually sustain all of this stuff, including the industrial stuff. And they're paying a big price in their economic growth and stability.
One question at the back there, I think I saw. No? Yes, you. Hand up.
Good evening. My name is Ava Wagner. I'm with the Conrad Foundation, Australian Foundation in Australia. Thank you so much for your presentation. Having just returned from Taiwan, it was really interesting to hear from you.
Could you just speak up a little? Maybe stand up. Thank you.
Just returned from Taiwan, it was interesting to hear from you on the risk of the major war between China and the US. My question is a bit along the lines of what you just addressed. So in Taiwan, we talked about AUKUS and the lack of social license, and that AUKUS was entered into without social license, and that the very country tourists would now see that. So in your view, how important is social license for preparing for war, and how could that be achieved? You alluded to that already.
I think it's really very, very important to look. In a democracy, we ought to be. We ought to be pretty honest. I mean, here I was an official myself for 16 years, and I think we've successive ministers of successive administrations in this country, I think, have got less and less open, frankly, about telling the truth about what's going on, and that's not healthy in my view. I think you've just been to Taiwan. I've been there several times. Here's a vibrant democracy. I can tell you lots of stories, mostly good ones, about here, what we've got at stake here in one sense is, but it's more than this, but it's about the whole future of a 24 million population, democratic, open, free press, all the rest of it, and letting it go down the Google or not. Now, that's only part of it. It's actually worse than that. There's more at stake here, because if the United States stands back and lets Taiwan go under, let me tell you, that has huge implications for the whole alliance network, including where countries even like Australia might stand. I don't think that we have much to fear from being honest with our public, including on AUKUS. The reason I say that is because in recent years, I've been doing quite a surprising number of briefings on what's really going on in China and so on, to company boards and other community groups. And what I find almost universally is I've never had any serious kickback or pushback about the facts or about what the generality is. The immediate statement, or most people, especially senior business people, say, why haven't we been told? Good question. Second thing is, what the hell should we be doing? And how do we work out how we actually fit in? We don't want to trip anybody up. Now, that doesn't surprise me. Some of you might, all my career I've been following polling, including internal government polling, on security issues in this country, going right back to the late 40s. And it's unbelievably consistent. So when you start talking about the sort of challenges international security we may have to face, it's not at all surprising to me that the community's instincts, the vast majority, are very solid, surprisingly so in many ways. Now, and if any community was not going to be solid, it might be in Canberra. I've just come back from tripping around regional Australia. I can tell you, there's not much questioning when people are informed when you go and brief a company board in Queensland, for instance, or for that matter, WA. Let me tell you, they just want to know what the hell we've got to do to get on and make things work well here. And again, a bit of anger actually with government about not being informed.
Ross, there's a question from Gavin Mount online. Do you have any specific suggestions for areas of enhancement in the information and political warfare space?
Gavin, it's a great question. And the answer is yes. There's a lot of things. I've actually written whole reports on this. So most of which is online. If you want to go to the CSBA website, you'll see actually two major reports on this and relate about what can and should be done and the nature of the challenge we face. First thing we've got to do is improve the information flows about what's actually going on to our media. Why is it that we're not even briefing journalists properly? If we do that, then, and we did this during the Cold War, incidentally, and it was pretty successful, then you don't get a lot of misinformation getting leaks. So when they're trying to feed information in, it just doesn't get traction. And it, in fact, often gets shot down like within hours. Second thing that's really, really important is Chinese language media in this country. We've got to do something about its control. At the moment, it's dominated by friendlies of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's really, we should not let stand. How we remedy that is a really interesting question, but I think it's doable. And I think it has to be done. Having said that, there are some interesting people who've done some stuff already that you may not be aware. Are you aware, for instance, that there is actually, whether you think it's a good or bad thing, is an interesting question, but it's not Chinese Communist Party. Are you aware that there is a Chinese language version of the Australian Everyday, which actually has quite a lot of people reading, obviously, with fluent Mandarin? Why is that they done that? Pretty obvious. They're providing an alternate flow of information and debate and discussion in their own language, which is easy for them to consume. That's one whole set of things. There's a lot of stuff in terms of computer security that needs to be. There's a lot already being done there, but there's more we've got to do, and it's going to mean more investment by all of us, but including by a range of corporates, not least in the telecommunications sector. I think the other thing. I think we've got to understand the nature of how they're operating. They're not just trying to influence our views on stuff. They are that. But understand that part of what they're doing is when they see a dispute and they look for someone who's actually at one fringe, far right, far left, doesn't really matter too much. And then they play on that and they try and ramp it up. And suddenly you see huge numbers of often, actually, they're not even people sometimes, of bloggers suddenly backing that case. And then they see a reaction, and you'll see some members, and because it'll be run in the press, as you probably know, a lot of the media choose their stories according to the scale of the inflow and the supporting social media coverage of a particular position. Then they'll pick it up, and then you'll get some leaders of community associations or some other leaders of the community coming out and saying, no, that's rubbish because and then they'll flip over and they'll back that. And suddenly you'll see a huge flow of stuff there. What they're trying to do is to get people to fight each other, argue each other, try to pull the society apart artificially. In reality, we know, although probably everyone in the room knows, if you actually look at who would argue a particular case, it's really amazing. If you see the social media input on some of the issues, you might have 80 to 100,000 people commenting within 24 hours. We know damn well that on that particular issue, there's nowhere like that number of people who would argue that case, certainly in 24 hours. It just doesn't happen. So where's it all coming from? And then you do the research and guess where it's coming from? Often indirectly. So we have to get smart. We have to improve our defences against that sort of thing. But also, very importantly, we've got to tell our people this is what's going on. And we ought to have case studies which we release publicly to show what actually happened on a particular case. We can do that without revealing all the things that might be particularly sensitive and how good our systems are in detecting various things.
Bill, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks very much, Rob. You mentioned Stalin, and one of the things that crossed my mind was that Xi Jinping is now the same age as Stalin was when the Soviets tested their nuclear weapon in Kazakhstan in 1949, and people had a similar apprehension about a major war between the superpowers. So the question I have is, to what extent are these scenarios dependent upon the personality and individuality of Xi Jinping? Do we know enough or much about the people below him, and whether there might be a potential Khrushchev in the wings who might reorient towards a kind of peaceful coexistence?
A great question, and Bill, great to see you. The reality is that there have been people who've been seen as being potential rivals, including more recently. You would have seen 2 ministers arbitrarily dismissed just in the last 6 months, blown away, just disappear. And some of those people don't survive physically. And so it's a pretty dangerous thing to be seen as being a competitor to Xi Jinping at the moment. And I think that's going to continue to be the case, whether we like it or not. So, but ultimately, my view is that the crunch time is actually the next 5 to 8 years. If we get through to the mid-30s and nothing much has happened in a serious way, then I think China's going to be at a different place. I think Xi Jinping will probably be under more pressure to be actually stand down, or maybe he's already gone. If most of the people who we know would be obvious alternatives are not likely to follow quite the same international posture as he has. But more to the point, in a way, by the mid-2030s, their potential to do that is going to be reduced. Now, there's a lot of elements of this equation. There's lots of, and a lot depends on what the United States does and the rest of us do as well. But yeah, it's a really important point. I think it's a question of, there's no doubt a lot is running on Xi Jinping, and but he has a lot of acolytes. He's actually in a pretty formidable position, and of course, he's really arguably got, if he wants it, tenure for life. Whether that's actually going to, we'll just have to wait and see. It's a really good thing to watch, though.
All right, well, I'm afraid time has elapsed and we've run out of it tonight. I'd like to say thank you very much to Ross for his very wide-ranging discussion this evening. It's given us a lot of food for thought over the holidays, no doubt. And good luck with your book. And we hope it's not another 15 years before we see you back at the ACT branch. And just a token of our appreciation, please. Thank you. Now, before everyone disappears, let me say again, just underline, this is the last event for the year. We're working already on a program for 2024. I hope to see you on that journey.